There is a dream that haunts the human psyche, a dream so universal, so ancient, that it seems to whisper from the genetic memory of our species itself. In this dream, you stand before a door. The door is familiar, yet strange. You know, with that peculiar certainty that only dreams provide, that behind this door lies something extraordinary, something that belongs to you, something that has always belonged to you. Your hand reaches for the handle. Your fingers wrap around cold metal. And then, just as you begin to turn it, you wake. But here is the strange thing, the thing that Carl Jung spent decades trying to understand. When you recall this dream in the morning light, you don't feel disappointment. You feel relief. A profound, shameful relief that floods through your body like cold water through burning veins. You are grateful you woke when you did. Grateful you never saw what waited on the other side. This is not a dream about fear of the unknown. This is something far more disturbing. This is a dream about fearing the known, fearing what you already are but refuse to become. Tonight, we descend into one of the mind's most paradoxical chambers. We explore the question that has tormented philosophers, destroyed artists, and paralyzed geniuses throughout human history. Why do we fear our own potential? Why does the possibility of our greatness terrify us more than the certainty of our mediocrity? The ancient Greeks had a word for this, hubris. But they misunderstood their own wisdom. They believed hubris meant reaching too high, aspiring beyond one's station. But the true meaning runs deeper, darker. The gods did not punish humans for reaching toward greatness. They punished them for the terror that made them sabotage themselves, just as their fingers brushed the divine. In the psychiatric wards of Vienna, Sigmund Freud identified what he called the death drive, Thanatos, the mysterious force that compels us toward our own destruction. But Freud never fully understood what he had discovered. The death drive is not a desire for annihilation. It is a defense mechanism against transformation. We would rather die as we are than live as what we might become. And in the analytical psychology laboratories of Zurich, Carl Jung mapped the architecture of what he called the shadow, that repository of all our repressed potential, our unlived lives, our forbidden powers. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But what Jung never explicitly stated was this: the darkness we fear most is not composed of our vices, our sins, our weaknesses. The deepest shadow is cast by our own unrealized greatness. The brightest light creates the darkest shadow. Consider this. Every spiritual tradition speaks of a moment of trial, a descent into darkness before the awakening. Jesus in the desert for 40 days. Buddha under the Bodhi tree facing Mara's temptations. Odysseus descending into Hades. Inanna stripped and hung on hooks in the underworld. These are not metaphors for external obstacles. They are maps of the internal war that rages when consciousness approaches its own expansion. The question we must ask is not why we fear our potential. The question is, what exactly are we afraid of? What waits behind that locked door? What transformation is so terrifying that we would rather live in quiet desperation than turn the handle? Tonight, we will turn that handle together. We will descend into the shadow, not to conquer it, but to understand it, to see it clearly for the first time. Because the greatest discovery of depth psychology is this: we cannot defeat what we refuse to see. We can only integrate it. This is not a journey for those seeking comfort. This is not a speech that offers easy answers or simple solutions. This is an exploration of the mind's most sophisticated defense mechanisms, the ways we protect ourselves from our own power, the ways we construct elaborate prisons and call them safety, the ways we choose the familiar agony of limitation over the terrifying ecstasy of expansion. We will explore the neuroscience of self-sabotage, the philosophy of becoming, the mythology of transformation, and the psychology of potential. We will trace this fear from its origins in childhood development through its manifestations in modern society. We will examine how culture itself is designed to keep you small, how language shapes the boundaries of your becoming, and how technology now mirrors back to us the very question we've been avoiding. What happens when we finally meet our own capacity? By the end of this journey, you will understand why you have been your own jailer, why you have sabotaged every attempt at greatness, why you feel relief when opportunities fail, and most importantly, you will understand what waits for you if you finally choose to step through that door. The ancient oracle at Delphi commanded, "Know thyself," but the full inscription, worn away by time, continued, "And you will know the universe and the gods." Self-knowledge was not the destination, it was the doorway you've been standing before your entire life. Are you ready to turn the handle? Then let us descend. In the beginning, there was no fear of potential. Watch an infant. Watch the pure, unbridled exploration of capacity. A child does not question whether they can learn to walk. They simply stand, fall, stand again. No existential crisis, no performance anxiety, no fear of their own becoming. But somewhere between that first breath and the development of self-consciousness, something happens. The door that was open begins to close, not from outside forces, though culture and conditioning play their role, but from within. The mind develops its first and most crucial survival mechanism, the ability to limit itself. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky identified what he called the zone of proximal development, the space between what a child can do independently and what they can achieve with guidance. But Vygotsky missed something crucial. At a certain point in development, children begin to avoid this zone altogether. They retreat from the edge of their capacity. They choose mastery over mystery. This is not laziness. This is not lack of ambition. This is the birth of a sophisticated psychological defense. The moment when the organism learns that potential itself can be dangerous. The first time you displayed a capacity that exceeded your parents' comfort, you learned a terrible lesson. Perhaps you were too intelligent, and your questions became threatening. Perhaps you were too creative, and your imagination became disruptive. Perhaps you were too passionate, and your intensity became overwhelming. The British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called this the false self, the adaptive personality we construct to survive in an environment that cannot hold our full being. But the false self is not simply a mask we wear. It is a prison we build, brick by brick, from the very materials of our potential. Every time your authentic capacity met with confusion, fear, or rejection, your developing psyche made a calculation. This is too much. I am too much. I must become less. The neuroscience behind this is profound. Dr. Stephen Porges's Polyvagal Theory reveals how our nervous system is constantly scanning for safety, a process called neuroception. But here's what's rarely discussed. Our nervous system can identify our own expansion as a threat. Growth triggers the same neural alarm systems as danger. The amygdala, that ancient alarm bell in the brain's limbic system, cannot distinguish between the fear of being attacked and the fear of becoming powerful. Both activate the same cascade of stress hormones, the same fight-flight-freeze response. From the amygdala's perspective, transformation equals death. And it's right. Transformation is death. The death of who you were. The death of the familiar self. The death of the comfortable narrative you've told yourself about your limitations. The ancient alchemists understood this. They spoke of mortificatio, the death that must precede resurrection, the blackening, the descent, the dissolution of form before the emergence of gold. But they were not speaking metaphorically. They were describing the psychological process of individuating consciousness, confronting the terror of its own expansion. In the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, initiates were placed in sarcophagi for 3 days, buried alive in darkness, to experience symbolic death before rebirth. This was not ritual sadism. This was preparation for the psychological reality of transformation. You must consent to die as you are, to live as you might become. But the fear of potential is not merely personal, it is collective, it is cultural. It is the invisible architecture of civilization itself. The French philosopher Michel Foucault spent his life mapping what he called biopower, the ways societies regulate and control bodies, minds, and possibilities. But even Foucault didn't fully articulate this. Every society is held together by a contract of mutual limitation. We agree to stay small so others don't have to feel small. We collude in collective mediocrity because greatness makes us uncomfortable. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. We want the permission to be extraordinary without the terror of actually becoming so." Consider the phenomenon of tall poppy syndrome, the cultural tendency to cut down those who rise above the crowd. This is not envy, though it wears envy's mask. This is collective enforcement of the social contract. When one person accesses their full potential, they implicitly challenge everyone else's excuses. They become a living mirror reflecting our own self-imposed limitations. The anthropologist Ernest Becker, in his masterwork, The Denial of Death, argued that all human civilization is fundamentally a defense mechanism against mortality. But he might have gone further. Civilization is also a defense mechanism against capacity. We build elaborate social structures not just to deny death, but to deny life. Life in its fullest, most terrifying amplitude. Think of the education system. We don't educate children to discover their unique genius. We educate them to fit standardized molds. The word education comes from the Latin educare, to lead out. But our schools don't lead out potential. They suppress it, they grade it, they measure it against arbitrary standards designed to produce compliant workers, not awakened individuals. The philosopher Ivan Illich called this deschooling, recognizing that institutional education is fundamentally about learning to limit yourself to what the system can measure and reward. The most devastating thing we teach children is not mathematics or history, it's the meta-lesson. Your worth is determined by your ability to conform, and so we grow into adults who have internalized this surveillance. We police our own potential with ruthless efficiency. We no longer need teachers or parents or bosses to keep us small. We have become our own wardens. The sociologist Irving Goffman described impression management, the ways we curate our presentation to fit social expectations. But this management goes deeper than behavior. We manage our own consciousness. We edit our thoughts before they fully form. We sabotage our visions before they crystallize into action. Language itself becomes a cage. The linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf proposed that language shapes cognition, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But consider how language shapes capacity. The words available to us determine the possibilities we can conceive. In English we say, "I am afraid." In Spanish, "Tengo miedo." I have fear. In English, fear becomes identity. In Spanish, fear is possession. Something you have, not something you are. This subtle grammatical difference creates different relationships to emotional states, different possibilities for transformation. But more insidiously, consider the words we lack. The Eskimos famously have dozens of words for snow because the distinctions matter to their survival. We have one word, potential, for the infinite varieties of unlived possibility. We have one word, fear, for 1,000 distinct qualities of resistance. We have no word for the terror of becoming what you've always known you could be. No word for the relief of remaining limited. No word for the specific shame of self-sabotage. These linguistic absences shape the boundaries of our consciousness. We cannot fully face what we cannot name. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." But we can go further. The limits of my language mean the limits of myself. The vocabulary we inherit determines the versions of ourselves we can imagine becoming, and so we speak in diminishing terms. We say, "I'm just," before describing ourselves. "I'm just a teacher. I'm just a parent. I'm just trying." That word "just" is not humility. It's preemptive self-diminishment. It's a linguistic defense mechanism against the terror of claiming our full capacity. We use conditional language, "I would," "I could," "I might," instead of declarative power, "I will," "I am," "I choose." Conditional language keeps us in a perpetual state of potential without actualization. It's potential as defense, not potential as destiny. Every culture has myths about forbidden knowledge, forbidden power, forbidden transformation. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, Icarus flying too close to the sun. These are not cautionary tales about external dangers. They are projections of our internal prohibition against accessing our full capacity. Prometheus was punished not for the theft itself, but for giving humans the means to their own divinity, fire, technology, autonomous power. The punishment? An eagle eating his liver for eternity, the liver regenerating each night. This is a perfect metaphor for self-sabotage, the organ that processes toxins being eternally devoured, eternally regenerating, eternally devoured again. Potential eternally consumed by its own fear. Eve did not bring sin into the world by eating the apple. She brought consciousness, the knowledge of good and evil, the capacity for choice, the terrible freedom of self-awareness. And the punishment was exile from the garden of unconscious innocence. Once you taste consciousness, you cannot return to the comfort of ignorance. Once you glimpse your potential, you cannot unsee it. You can only spend your life running from it. Icarus fell, not because he flew too high, but because his wings were made of wax and feathers, a false construction that couldn't sustain genuine flight. The real tragedy is not the fall. It's that we internalize the wrong lesson. We learn to fear flying rather than to build better wings. We learn to stay low rather than to honor the genuine materials of our construction. The depth psychologist James Hillman wrote about the acorn theory, the idea that each person contains from birth a unique essence, a potential self waiting to unfold, like an oak tree encoded in an acorn. But culture, family, and fear conspire to prevent that unfolding. We remain acorns forever, fertilized and watered, but never breaking open, never risking the vulnerability of germination. Why? Because germination requires the seed to crack, to split open, to let go of its perfect, closed, protected form. The acorn must consent to its own destruction to become the oak, and so we choose to remain seeds, potential without actualization, promise without fulfillment. We collect around us all the conditions for growth, the right soil, the right water, the right light, and still we refuse to crack open, because cracking open feels like death. And it is death. The death of the seed is the birth of the tree. But let us descend deeper into the biological machinery of limitation, because this fear is not merely psychological or cultural, it is neurological. It is written into the very architecture of the brain. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on constructed emotion reveals that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It doesn't react to reality. It predicts reality, then adjusts. And one of its most crucial predictions is this: how much energy will this action require? How much danger does this present? Expansion requires energy. Growth requires resources. The brain, operating on evolutionary programming, designed for scarcity, treats potential as a luxury it cannot afford. Better to stay small, stay known, stay safe. Better to conserve energy for known threats than to expend it on unknown possibilities. This is the tyranny of the predictive brain. It prioritizes efficiency over expansion. It chooses the familiar over the optimal. It makes decisions based on past experience, which means it can never choose a future that hasn't happened before. The default mode network, that system of brain regions active during rest and introspection, is constantly generating narratives about who you are. Dr. Marcus Reichel, who discovered this network, found that it's incredibly energy-intensive. Your brain spends more energy maintaining your sense of self than it does on external tasks. But here's the devastating implication. Your brain has an energy investment in keeping you exactly as you are. Every story it's told about your limitations, every prediction it's made about your incapacity, every pattern it's recognized in your past failures, all of this becomes infrastructure, neurological infrastructure. The brain has built highways of limitation and footpaths of possibility. To change this is not a matter of willpower. It requires neuroplasticity, the actual rewiring of neural pathways. And neuroplasticity is exhausting. The brain resists it with every tool in its arsenal: rationalization, distraction, self-sabotage, and, most powerfully, fear. Dr. Joseph Ledoux's research on the amygdala reveals that fear memories are essentially permanent. They can be suppressed, contextualized, or overridden, but never truly deleted. Every time your potential triggered fear, whether through parental disapproval, peer rejection, or personal failure, that association was encoded. And those encodings accumulate. By adulthood, you've built an entire library of fear associations around your capacity. The brain learns potential equals danger, and it protects you by keeping you small. This is not failure. This is the nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, keeping you alive by keeping you limited. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "He who would learn to fly one day must first learn to stand and walk and run and climb and dance. One cannot fly into flying." But even Nietzsche didn't fully grasp the neurology. Learning to fly requires unlearning to fear flight. It requires rewriting the fundamental algorithms of self-limitation. Now we descend into the heart of darkness, the place where potential goes to die. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, through the thousand subtle ways we sabotage ourselves while believing we're trying to succeed. Self-sabotage is not weakness. It is one of the mind's most sophisticated operations. It is a theatre production we stage for ourselves, complete with elaborate sets, convincing dialogue, and a plot that always ends the same way, just before breakthrough. The psychologist Gay Hendricks identified what he calls the upper limit problem, the phenomenon where people unconsciously sabotage themselves when things are going too well, not because they don't want success, but because their nervous system has a thermostat for how much joy, success, or expansion it can tolerate before triggering alarms. Think about this. You've probably experienced moments where life was working, where things were aligning, where you were approaching a breakthrough, and then you did something. You picked a fight. You missed a deadline. You made a careless error. You got sick. You created drama. Not because you wanted to fail, but because success was triggering a deeper fear than failure ever could. This is the upper limit problem. Your capacity for success is constrained not by external circumstances, but by internal thermostats. And these thermostats were set in childhood, calibrated to the amount of joy, power, or recognition your family system could tolerate. But the mechanisms go deeper. Consider the phenomenon of imposter syndrome, that pervasive feeling that your success is fraudulent, that you'll be exposed as a fake, that you don't deserve your achievements. The traditional interpretation is that imposter syndrome is about low self-esteem, but that's incomplete. Dr. Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who first identified imposter syndrome, noted it was especially prevalent among high-achieving women. But it's not about achievement. It's about the psychological cost of exceeding the limitations your family, culture, or gender role prescribe for you. Imposter syndrome is the psyche's way of punishing you for growing beyond your assigned boundaries. You feel like an imposter because, from the perspective of your original programming, you are an imposter. You're pretending to be someone who has permission to be powerful, capable, extraordinary, and every success triggers the alarm. This isn't who you're supposed to be. You're going to get caught. You need to go back to being small. The solution to imposter syndrome is not building self-esteem. It's recognizing that the feeling of being an imposter is evidence of growth. It means you've exceeded your old identity. The feeling isn't pathology, it's metamorphosis. The caterpillar in the chrysalis might feel like an imposter butterfly, but the wings are real. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the psyche, identifying various complexes and archetypes that operate autonomously within consciousness. But one of his most disturbing discoveries was this: we each contain what he called the internal saboteur, a part of the psyche that actively works against our own growth. This is not the Freudian superego, simply enforcing parental rules. This is something more sinister. The internal saboteur is intelligent, strategic. It knows you better than anyone else because it is you. It knows exactly which thoughts will stop you, which doubts will freeze you, which distractions will derail you. The saboteur speaks in your voice. It sounds rational. It presents itself as wisdom, as caution, as realism. This isn't the right time. You're not ready yet. What if you fail? What if you succeed and can't handle it? Who are you to think you're special? Remember what happened last time? The saboteur is a master of timing. It waits until you're on the edge of breakthrough, when you're most vulnerable, most exposed, most in need of your own support. And then it strikes. Not with obvious opposition, but with subtle questioning. Not with outright sabotage, but with sophisticated rationalization. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke understood this when he wrote about the dragon, that part of us that guards our greatest treasures. But the dragon doesn't guard treasure for you. The dragon guards treasure from you. It is the defender of your limitations, the sentinel of your fear, the gatekeeper who asks, "Who are you to claim your own power?" And here's the terrible truth. You cannot kill the dragon. Every hero's journey that ends with slaying the dragon misses the point. The dragon is not your enemy. The dragon is your fear of your own fire. The dragon's flames are the power you're afraid to claim. You don't slay it. You integrate it. You recognize it as the guardian of power you've disowned. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite. The saboteur that blocks your potential is your potential, inverted. The energy you spend sabotaging yourself is exactly the energy you need to actualize yourself. The question is not how to defeat the saboteur, but how to redirect its tremendous intelligence toward your expansion rather than your contraction. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation is this: we become attached to our limitations. We develop what psychologists call secondary gain, the hidden benefits of remaining stuck. Your limitation becomes your identity. I'm someone who struggles with, I've always been bad at. I have a fear of. These aren't descriptions, they're identities. And identity is powerful. Identity provides coherence, narrative, meaning. Who would you be without your limitations? Without your struggles? Without the story you've told yourself about why you can't? The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Man is condemned to be free. We experience freedom not as liberation, but as condemnation, because freedom means responsibility. If you're truly free, if you're truly capable, then your current circumstances are your choice. And that's terrifying. It's easier to believe you're limited, that circumstances constrain you, that you're a victim of conditions. Because victimhood, however painful, provides relief from the burden of possibility. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, survivor of Auschwitz, wrote about Sunday neurosis, the form of depression that afflicts people when they stop long enough to confront the emptiness of their existence. We stay busy, stay distracted, stay limited, not despite the suffering it causes, but because the suffering is preferable to the confrontation with our freedom. Consider how people react to opportunities, genuine opportunities, chances to grow, expand, actualize potential. Watch the immediate response, not conscious enthusiasm, but unconscious resistance. The body tenses, the mind generates obstacles, the emotions flood with ambivalence. Why? Because opportunity is dangerous. Opportunity demands that you leave behind the comfort of your limitations. Opportunity asks you to die as you are and be reborn as someone you don't yet know. And the devil you know is always preferable to the God you might become. The psychoanalyst Melanie Klein identified what she called the paranoid schizoid position, a primitive psychological defense where we split the world into good and bad, safe and dangerous, to manage overwhelming complexity. But we also split ourselves. We create a safe self and a dangerous self, and we exile the dangerous self, the powerful self, the capable self, the extraordinary self, into the shadow. We keep ourselves safe by keeping ourselves small. We protect ourselves from the terror of potential by embracing the comfort of limitation. And then we wonder why life feels so hollow, so constrained, so far from what we once dreamed. Beneath all the mechanisms, beneath all the sabotage, beneath all the sophisticated defenses, there is a wound so primal, so fundamental, that most people live their entire lives without seeing it directly. This is the wound of unworthiness, not the intellectual belief I am unworthy. That's too conscious, too articulated. The wound of unworthiness is pre-verbal. It's the ambient sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, that you're not quite right, that you don't quite belong, that if people really knew you, they wouldn't want you. The psychologist John Bradshaw called this toxic shame. Shame not about something you've done, but about who you are. Shame that's attached to existence itself. This shame operates below consciousness, coloring every perception, filtering every experience, sabotaging every attempt at greatness. Where does it come from? The developmental psychologist D.W. Winnicott identified the crucial importance of what he called the good enough mother, the caregiver who provides sufficient attunement to allow the child to develop a secure sense of self. But what happens when attunement fails? What happens when the infant's authentic expression meets with confusion, rejection, or absence? The infant, lacking the cognitive capacity to think, "My caregiver is unavailable," instead concludes, "I am unlovable." The child, unable to comprehend "my parents are overwhelmed," decides, "I am too much." The adolescent, experiencing rejection, determines, "There is something wrong with me." And so the wound forms, the fundamental sense that you are deficient, insufficient, unworthy. And from this wound grows all the sophisticated defenses. Self-sabotage is not the problem. Self-sabotage is the symptom. The problem is the belief that you don't deserve the fullness of your potential. The spiritual teacher A.H. Almas calls this the whole, the sense of inner deficiency that we spend our lives trying to fill with achievement, relationships, substances, distractions. But nothing fills it, because it's not actually empty. It's full of the potential you've disowned, the power you've rejected, the glory you've deemed yourself unworthy to claim. You fear your potential because claiming it would require believing you deserve it. And that belief contradicts the fundamental wound. So you remain limited, suffering, stuck, not because you want to, but because suffering confirms your unworthiness. It's a closed loop, a perfect trap. You stay small to prove you were right to stay small. But the fear of potential is not merely psychological. In the modern era, it has become technological. We have created systems, machines, and environments specifically designed to keep us from accessing our full capacity. Consider the attention economy. The business model of social media is not to help you grow, it's to keep you scrolling. The algorithm doesn't ask, what does this person need to actualize their potential? It asks, what will keep this person engaged? And engagement, it turns out, is maximized not by expansion, but by triggering the most primitive parts of the brain: fear, outrage, envy, comparison. Every minute you spend scrolling is a minute you're not becoming. Every dopamine hit from a notification is a replacement for the deeper satisfaction of actualized potential. Every comparison you make to curated highlight reels is a reinforcement of your sense of inadequacy. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this psychopolitics, the way neoliberal capitalism exploits not just our labor, but our psyche itself. We're not oppressed by external force. We're seduced into self-optimization that actually optimizes us for consumption, compliance, and containment. The workplace has become a laboratory of limitation. Performance reviews measure your capacity against arbitrary metrics that have nothing to do with your actual potential. Job descriptions define you by function, not by possibility. Career paths channel your becoming into narrow corridors of acceptable development. The scholar David Graeber identified bullshit jobs, positions that even the people holding them believe are meaningless. But these jobs serve a crucial function. They absorb potential. They take intelligent, capable humans and occupy them with tasks that require a fraction of their capacity. This isn't inefficiency. It's a feature, not a bug. A population operating at a fraction of their potential is easier to manage than a population of fully actualized individuals. And education, modern education, is not designed to help you discover your unique genius. It's designed to make you employable. The philosopher Ken Robinson points out that schools are organized like factories, with bells, batch processing, and standardization. We don't develop potential. We manufacture workers. Even therapy, which should be a space for exploring your full capacity, often becomes another mechanism of adjustment. The question is rarely, what is your potential? The question is, how can we help you fit back into society? We don't liberate you from limitation. We help you cope with it more effectively. But the fear of potential is not merely individual. It is collective. Carl Jung wrote about the collective unconscious, the shared repository of human experience, myth, and archetype. But there is also a collective shadow, the repressed potential of the entire species. Consider the defining question of our age. If we're so technologically advanced, why are we still so psychologically primitive? Why do we have the capacity to reach Mars, but not to resolve basic human conflicts? Why can we sequence the genome, but not heal generational trauma? Because collective evolution requires that we face our collective shadow, and our collective shadow contains not just our collective sins, war, slavery, genocide, exploitation, but our collective potential. The unlived lives, the unexpressed genius, the suppressed creativity, the denied divinity. Every great leap in human consciousness has been preceded by a dark night of the soul, both individually and collectively. The Renaissance was preceded by the Black Death. The Enlightenment was preceded by religious wars. Modernity was preceded by World War. We don't evolve smoothly. We evolve through crisis, through confrontation with shadow, through the terror of transformation. And now we stand at another threshold. Artificial intelligence forces us to confront the question, what is uniquely human? What is our potential beyond what machines can do? The answer is terrifying because it requires that we finally claim the capacity we've been suppressing, consciousness itself. Not intelligence, not computation, but consciousness. The capacity for meaning, for depth, for transformation. AI is not a threat to humanity. AI is a mirror reflecting our avoidance of our own potential. We've spent centuries building external intelligence because we're afraid to develop internal intelligence. We've created thinking machines because we're afraid to think deeply ourselves. We've automated capacity because we're afraid to actualize our own. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues that our era is defined by a gap between what we know and what we do. We know about climate change but don't act. We know about inequality but don't address it. We know about our potential but don't actualize it. This gap is not ignorance. It's a specific form of psychological defense, knowing without integrating, understanding without transforming. And this defense is crumbling. The pace of change, the complexity of challenges, the intensity of crisis, all of it is forcing a confrontation. We can no longer afford to remain small. But the terror of growing is proportional to how long we've stayed small. So let us map the precise architecture of resistance. How exactly do you stop yourself? What are the mechanisms, moment by moment, by which you sabotage your own becoming? First, there is rationalization. You don't admit you're afraid. You create logical reasons why you can't act. It's not the right time. I need more preparation. The conditions aren't optimal. These sound reasonable. They are the voice of wisdom, but they are the disguised voice of fear. Second, there is distraction. You have an important creative project, a life-changing decision, a transformative action to take, and suddenly you need to clean the entire house. You need to research something tangentially related. You need to respond to emails, scroll through news, have that conversation you've been avoiding. Distraction is not laziness. It's a sophisticated avoidance mechanism disguised as productivity. Third, there is numbing. Alcohol, drugs, food, sex, shopping, work, entertainment. Anything to avoid feeling the discomfort of growth. Not because these things are inherently bad, but because you use them to medicate against the fear of transformation. You anesthetize yourself against your own potential. Fourth, there is drama. You create crises that demand your attention and make it impossible to focus on growth. Relationship conflict, financial emergency, health problems, family chaos. Not all of it is self-created, but notice the timing. Notice how crisis tends to emerge precisely when you're on the verge of breakthrough. Fifth, there is perfectionism. You can't move forward until everything is perfect, until you're fully prepared, until you're completely ready. But perfection is impossible. Perfectionism is not high standards. It's a defense mechanism. It's a way to avoid the vulnerability of imperfect action, imperfect becoming. Sixth, there is comparison. You measure yourself against others who seem further along, more talented, more successful. And in the comparison, you find the reason you can't succeed. They have advantages I don't have. They're more naturally gifted. I'm too old, too young, too late. Comparison is not motivation. It's evidence gathering for your pre-existing belief in your limitations. Seventh, there is self-attack. When you do act, when you do create, when you do risk, your inner voice becomes cruel. That's not good enough. You're embarrassing yourself. What will people think? This voice sounds like it's trying to protect you from external criticism, but it's trying to protect you from your own success. And eighth, perhaps most insidiously, there is spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid facing your fear. Everything happens for a reason. I'm trusting the universe. If it's meant to be, it will happen. These can be genuine wisdom or sophisticated avoidance. The difference is whether they lead to action or justify inaction. The psychologist Stephen Hayes, founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, calls this experiential avoidance, the attempt to avoid uncomfortable internal experiences. But the internal experience you're avoiding is not just fear. It's aliveness. It's potential. It's the raw, uncomfortable, exhilarating feeling of becoming. You've built an entire lifestyle around avoiding this feeling, not because you're weak, but because you're strong. It takes tremendous energy to suppress potential. It takes constant vigilance to maintain limitation. You've been working incredibly hard, just in the direction of staying small. Leonard Cohen sang, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." But the crack is not a flaw. The crack is the moment when your defenses finally fail, when your mechanisms of suppression finally exhaust themselves, when you can no longer avoid the confrontation with your own potential. For some, the crack comes through crisis, illness, loss, failure, collapse. What the mystics call the dark night of the soul and psychologists call ego death. Everything that held you together falls apart, and in that falling apart, you discover what remains, what cannot fall apart, your essence, your potential. For others, the crack comes through grace, a moment of unexpected beauty, inexplicable joy, or sudden clarity that reveals how small you've been living. You see for a moment what could be, and you can never unsee it. For still others, the crack comes through exhaustion. You've tried so hard to maintain your limitations, to keep yourself small, to avoid your becoming, that you finally just give up. Not in despair, but in surrender. You stop fighting your own expansion. The psychologist Carl Rogers identified what he called the fully functioning person, someone who is open to experience, lives existentially, trusts their organism, embraces creativity, and accepts freedom. But to become fully functioning requires that you first become fully dysfunctional, that your old structures must collapse before new ones can emerge. This is the death that the mystics speak of, the death that the alchemists mapped, the death encoded in every transformation myth. You cannot become what you're meant to be while remaining what you are. Something must die. What dies is not you. What dies is your idea of you, your story about your limitations, your identity constructed from fear. And what's born? Not a new self, your actual self. The self that was always there, waiting beneath the layers of defense and conditioning. The oak that was always encoded in the acorn. So we begin the archaeology, the careful excavation of potential buried beneath layers of fear, conditioning, and suppression. This is not a process of becoming someone new. This is a process of uncovering who you actually are. The first layer to excavate is awareness itself. Before you can change anything, you must see it. Not think about it abstractly, but witness it directly. The moment when you're about to sabotage yourself. The instant when the fear arises. The precise way your mind generates rationalizations. This is what Buddhist psychology calls mindfulness. Not a relaxation technique, but a methodology for investigating the mechanics of your own consciousness. You begin to notice, there's the familiar feeling in my chest before I abandon a project. There's the specific thought pattern that precedes self-sabotage. There's the exact emotion I'm avoiding by staying distracted. But awareness alone is not enough. Awareness can become another defense, spiritual voyeurism, watching yourself stay stuck without actually changing. The second layer is compassion, turning toward yourself with the same kindness you'd offer to a frightened child. The psychologist Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion reveals that self-criticism doesn't motivate change, it paralyzes. But self-compassion creates the safety necessary for growth. When you can hold your fear gently, when you can acknowledge your sabotage without judgment, when you can see your limitation with tenderness, then transformation becomes possible. This is counterintuitive. We believe we need to be harsh with ourselves to change. We believe self-criticism is discipline, but self-criticism is fear, and fear reinforces the very patterns you're trying to transform. Compassion is not weakness. Compassion is the courage to see yourself clearly without defense. The third layer is curiosity, approaching your fear not as an enemy to defeat, but as a mystery to explore. What exactly are you afraid of? Not the surface fear, failure, rejection, humiliation, but the deeper fear beneath. If I actually succeeded, what would I lose? What identity would I have to release? What comfortable suffering would I have to abandon? These are not rhetorical questions. These are archaeological tools. Each answer reveals another layer, another depth, another hidden chamber in the architecture of your limitation. But excavation is only half the work. The other half is integration, taking what you've discovered in the shadow and bringing it into consciousness. This is the true meaning of Jung's individuation, not perfection, not enlightenment, but wholeness, including everything, rejecting nothing. The parts of yourself you've exiled, your power, your desire, your creativity, your anger, your joy, your genius, all of it has been surviving in the shadow, waiting to be welcomed back. But you can't simply repress different things. You must fundamentally alter your relationship to yourself. This is where the work becomes subtle, sophisticated, almost like alchemy. You're not adding something or removing something. You're transmuting the relationship between elements. Fear doesn't disappear. It transforms from paralysis into information. Resistance doesn't vanish. It becomes feedback about boundaries and capacity. The somatic psychologist Peter Levine's work on trauma reveals that transformation happens not through thinking, but through feeling, through allowing the body to complete interrupted self-protective responses, through sensation, through nervous system regulation. Your potential is not an idea to understand, but an energy to embody. This means the path forward is not through your head, but through your body. Not through analysis, but through action. Not through understanding why you fear your potential, but through choosing it anyway, through taking action despite fear, through building new neural pathways through repetition. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself, doesn't happen through insight. It happens through experience. Each time you act in alignment with your potential instead of your fear, you're literally creating new neural connections. Each time you choose expansion over contraction, you're training your nervous system that growth is safe. The psychologist Donald Hebb discovered what's now called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together. Your current neural patterns support limitation because that's what you've practiced, but you can practice new patterns. Not easily, not quickly, but systematically. So what is the practice? How do you actually transform your relationship to your potential? First, you must learn to recognize the sensation of fear not as a stop sign, but as a compass. Fear doesn't mean, don't go there. Fear means, this matters. The things that scare you most are precisely the things most aligned with your potential. Not fear of danger, that's different, but fear of bigness, fear of visibility, fear of power. The artist Stephen Pressfield calls this resistance, that force that emerges whenever you're attempting something important. Resistance is not random. Resistance is proportional to importance. The more something matters to your soul, the more resistance will emerge to block it. So you learn to use fear as guidance. When you feel that familiar contraction, that voice saying, not now, not you, not ready, that's not wisdom. That's fear. And fear is showing you exactly where you need to go. Second, you practice micro acts of courage, not grand gestures, not dramatic transformations. Tiny moments where you choose differently than you usually choose. You speak the thought you usually suppress. You share the work you usually hide. You take the action you usually postpone. These micro-acts seem insignificant, but they accumulate. Each one is evidence to your nervous system that growth is survivable. Each one builds a new neural pathway. Each one deposits a vote for a different identity. Eventually, the accumulated micro-acts reach a tipping point, what Malcolm Gladwell calls the moment of critical mass, and suddenly transformation that seemed impossible becomes inevitable. Third, you develop what psychologist Carl Jung calls a growth mindset, but not the simplified version often taught. True growth mindset is not believing you can learn anything. It's recognizing that you are not fixed, that your current capacity is not your final capacity, that limitations are not identity. This requires grieving the loss of your old identity, grieving the comfort of your limitations, grieving the secondary gains you received from staying small. You can't fully step into potential while still clinging to limitation. There must be a deliberate releasing, a conscious letting go. Fourth, you create what James Clear calls identity-based habits, but reversed. Not habits that reflect who you are, but habits that create who you're becoming. You don't wait until you feel like a writer to write. You write, and through writing, you become a writer. You don't wait until you feel powerful to act powerfully. You act powerfully, and through action, you become powerful. This is the ancient wisdom that Aristotle articulated. We are what we repeatedly do. But the modern neuroscience adds, and what we repeatedly do literally changes the structure of our brain, the regulation of our nervous system, and the expression of our genes. Fifth, you surround yourself with witnesses, people who see your potential even when you can't, who reflect back to you your capacity when you're lost in limitation, who hold the vision of your becoming when you've forgotten it. Not cheerleaders blindly saying, "You can do it," but conscious witnesses who see both your fear and your potential and refuse to collude with the fear. The psychologist Lev Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development is not just about children. It's about all growth. You need someone who's slightly ahead of where you are, who can see the next step you can't see, who can guide you into capacity you don't yet trust you have. Sixth, you develop what Eugene Gendlin calls focusing, the ability to sense the felt sense of a situation, to tune into the body's wisdom, to feel the edge between where you are and where you're growing. Growth has a feeling. It's uncomfortable but not painful. It's stretching but not breaking. It's alive but not comfortable. You learn to seek out this feeling rather than avoid it. You learn to recognize, there's the edge. There's where I'm meeting my limitation. There's where growth is happening. And you learn to stay with it rather than retreating to comfort or pushing through to overwhelm. But perhaps most importantly, you must craft a new mythology, a new story about who you are and what's possible. Because you've been living in a story constructed from limitation, and stories have tremendous power. They shape perception, filter reality, determine behavior. The narrative psychologist Dan McAdams's research reveals that identity is not a fact. It's a story we tell ourselves, and we can revise the story, not by denying the past, but by recontextualizing it. What if your limitations weren't your nature but your training? What if your fears weren't truths but habits? What if your potential wasn't distant but dormant? Every hero's journey begins with a call to adventure, the invitation to leave the ordinary world and enter the extraordinary. But the hero initially refuses the call. They have reasons, good reasons, why they can't go. The hero's journey is not about heroes being brave. It's about ordinary people finally accepting the call they've been refusing. You've been refusing the call your entire life, the call to your potential, the call to your power, the call to your purpose. You've had excellent reasons for refusing, reasons drawn from real experiences of pain, rejection, and failure. But those reasons are not destiny. They're the threshold guardian, testing whether you really want to cross. And here's what the mythology reveals. You don't cross the threshold by becoming fearless. You cross it by choosing growth over comfort despite the fear. The hero is not someone without fear. The hero is someone who acts in the presence of fear, who says yes to the adventure even while trembling. This is the initiation, the moment when you consciously choose to stop living from your conditioning and start living from your potential. Not perfectly, not completely, but decisively. You plant your flag on the side of becoming, and what you discover, what every hero discovers, is that the monsters were illusions, the guards were shadows, the dangers were projections. What waited beyond the threshold wasn't death, but birth. Not the destruction of yourself, but the discovery of yourself. Now we arrive at the heart of the alchemical transformation, the integration of shadow. Because your potential doesn't live in the light of consciousness. It lives in the shadow of the unconscious. All the parts of yourself you've disowned, rejected, repressed. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." But he also wrote, "To confront a person with their shadow is to show them their own light. The shadow is not just your darkness. The shadow is your gold, your power that you deemed too dangerous, your creativity that you feared was too strange, your intelligence that you worried was too much, your sexuality that you thought was too intense, your anger that you believed was too destructive, your joy that you feared you didn't deserve." The process of shadow integration is simple but not easy. You must turn toward what you've been turning away from. You must claim what you've been disclaiming. You must own what you've been disowning. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse or embracing every desire without discernment. Integration is not indulgence. Integration is consciousness. It's bringing into awareness, acknowledging, accepting, and then choosing how to express or not express these energies wisely. When you integrate your shadow anger, you don't become rageful. You become capable of healthy boundaries. When you integrate your shadow sexuality, you don't become promiscuous. You become alive in your body. When you integrate your shadow power, you don't become dominating. You become capable of leadership. Shadow integration transforms raw, unconscious energy into refined, conscious capacity. The very traits you feared in yourself become, when integrated, your greatest strengths. The Jungian analyst Robert Johnson wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." But he meant accept in the fullest sense, not resigning yourself to it, but acknowledging it fully, seeing it clearly, including it in your sense of self. Your potential terrifies you because it includes everything you've put in shadow. To claim your potential, you must first claim your shadow. This is the descent that precedes every ascent, the going down that precedes every rising up, the death that precedes every resurrection. But let us turn now to a practical technology, a method for working directly with potential. Dr. Benjamin Hardy, psychologist and researcher, has developed what he calls future self psychology, the practice of deliberately designing the relationship between your current self and your future self. Most people experience their future self as a stranger, someone unreal, distant, irrelevant to current decisions. This is why we sacrifice long-term potential for short-term comfort. But Hardy's research reveals that you can train yourself to experience your future self as vividly as your current self. The practice is simple. Regularly visualize your future self with specific sensory detail, not just successful or happy, but specific. Where are you? What are you wearing? How do you move? Who are you with? What do you feel? What have you overcome? What have you created? This is not positive thinking or fantasy. This is neurological programming. Your brain uses simulation to prepare for the future. If you simulate limitation, you prepare for limitation. If you simulate potential, you prepare for potential. But there's a crucial addition to this practice. You must also feel the emotions of your future self, not just see the circumstances, but embody the state. This is what neuroscientist Dr. Joe Dispenza's work reveals. When you combine clear intention with elevated emotion, you signal your genes to express differently, your brain to wire differently, your body to regulate differently. You're not manifesting through mystical means. You're using the brain's neuroplasticity, the nervous system's responsiveness, and the body's sensitivity to signal and meaning. You're essentially hacking your own biology by deliberately practicing the state you want to become stable. And here's the profound part. Your future self is not waiting somewhere ahead in time. Your future self exists now as potential. Every time you act from your future self instead of your past self, you're collapsing time. You're bringing the future into the present. You're actualizing potential through choice. But individual transformation, however profound, is not sufficient, because the fear of potential is not merely personal, it's cultural, systemic, collective. And collective transformation requires that we address not just individual psychology, but social structure. This is where the work becomes political, not in the partisan sense, but in the original Greek sense, politikos, concerning the polis, the community. How do we create cultures that support rather than suppress potential? How do we design systems that liberate rather than limit? How do we evolve collectively? The sociologist Peter Berger wrote about world building, the way societies construct shared realities through language, ritual, and institution. But what if we deliberately built a world designed to support human potential? What would that world look like? Education would be transformed from standardization to individuation, identifying each person's unique genius and cultivating it. Work would shift from exploitation to expression, structures that allow people to contribute their gifts rather than sell their time. Economics would evolve from scarcity to abundance, recognizing that human potential is infinitely generative when freed. Social systems would support rather than suppress psychological development. Universal access to therapy, coaching, and contemplative practice. Cultural narratives would celebrate transformation rather than conformity, stories that honor the hero's journey in all its messy, non-linear reality. This is not utopian fantasy, this is evolutionary necessity. The challenges facing humanity, ecological collapse, technological disruption, social fragmentation, cannot be solved at the level of consciousness that created them. They require access to human potential we've kept locked away. The crisis is forcing the confrontation. We can no longer afford to stay small. The question is whether we'll accept this invitation or whether we'll cling to limitation even as it destroys us. The philosopher Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." We don't defeat the culture of limitation. We outgrow it by actualizing alternatives. And so we arrive at the final integration, the recognition that the fear of potential and the potential itself are not separate. They're two aspects of the same energy. The same force that makes you contract in fear is the force that could make you expand in power. This is the deepest teaching of the alchemists. Transformation doesn't require adding something you lack. It requires transmuting what you already have. The lead is already gold, just in another form. The caterpillar already contains the butterfly, just in another structure. You don't overcome the fear of your potential by defeating it. You transform the fear into fuel. The energy you've been using to suppress yourself becomes the energy that actualizes yourself. Same energy, different direction. This is the secret hidden in every mystical tradition, every depth psychology, every transformative technology. Resistance is not separate from capacity. Resistance is capacity inverted. The strongest resistance indicates the greatest potential. The deepest fear guards the highest treasure. When you learn to read resistance as information rather than obstacle, everything changes. Resistance says, "This matters. This is important. This is exactly where your potential lies." The path forward is not around the resistance, but through it. This is the warrior's path, the mystic's path, the artist's path, the conscious human's path, toward the fear, through the fire, into the unknown. Not because you're unafraid, but because you've decided that living into your potential matters more than living in your comfort. And what you discover when you finally cross that threshold, when you finally turn that handle, when you finally step through that door you've been standing in front of your entire life, what you discover is not what you expected. You expected to find greatness, success, achievement, recognition, but what you actually find is simplicity. You find home. You find the deepest relaxation, the relaxation of no longer fighting yourself. You find what the Buddhists call original face, the self you've always been beneath all the conditioning. You discover that your potential was never about becoming someone else. It was about becoming more fully yourself. The journey was not forward into something new, but backward into something ancient. The essential self, waiting patiently beneath all the masks, all the defenses, all the fears. And in that recognition, the fear dissolves. Not because you've defeated it, but because you've understood it. The fear was never about the danger of potential. The fear was about the grief of recognizing how long you've lived below your capacity. The fear was about the responsibility of knowing better, and therefore needing to do better. But with that grief comes liberation. With that responsibility comes power. With that knowledge comes choice. You can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer use ignorance as excuse. You've seen behind the curtain. You've felt the truth. You know what you are. And what you are is not the small, limited, fearful identity you've been performing. What you are is potential itself, consciousness evolving, capacity actualizing, possibility becoming. You are the universe's way of waking up to itself, creating itself, knowing itself. This is not grandiosity. This is physics. You are literally made of star stuff. The atoms in your body were forged in the hearts of dying stars billions of years ago. You are the cosmos, compressed into human form, experiencing itself subjectively, and your potential is not personal, it's cosmic. When you actualize your capacity, you're participating in the universe's drive toward greater complexity, greater consciousness, greater beauty. You're not just becoming yourself. You're becoming an instrument through which the potential of existence itself can express. And so we return to where we began, standing before the door. But now, perhaps, you see it differently. The door was never locked. You were never trapped. You were only afraid. The fear of your potential is not a pathology to cure or a weakness to overcome. It is a rite of passage, the guardian at the threshold testing whether you're ready to enter the mystery of your own becoming. Every great transformation begins with fear. The question is not whether you'll feel fear. The question is whether you'll let fear determine your choices, whether you'll let the protection of limitation supersede the possibility of liberation. Throughout this journey, we've descended into the architecture of fear, mapped its origins in childhood, its encoding in neurology, its reinforcement through culture, its sophisticated mechanisms of self-sabotage. We've seen how you've learned to fear your own power, distrust your own capacity, reject your own potential. But we've also explored the technology of transformation, the practices, the frameworks, the methodologies for integrating shadow, actualizing potential, and becoming fully yourself. Not through force or willpower, but through awareness, compassion, courage, and choice. The path forward is not complex, it's devastatingly simple. Feel the fear, recognize it as information, not instruction. Feel the resistance, see it as the measure of meaning. Feel the contraction, choose expansion anyway. Feel the pull toward limitation, choose liberation instead. Moment by moment, choice by choice, day by day. You rewire your brain. You regulate your nervous system. You tell a new story. You build new pathways. You practice new patterns. You become new, which is to say, you become authentically yourself for perhaps the first time. The mystics were right. You must die to be reborn. but they were speaking psychologically, not physically. The ego identity constructed from fear must dissolve so the authentic self can emerge. The false self must be abandoned so the true self can be embraced. The small story must end so the larger story can begin. And here's what they never tell you about transformation. It's not a moment, it's a practice. You don't reach enlightenment and stay there. You touch it, lose it, touch it again. You expand, contract, expand further. You grow, plateau, grow again. It's not linear progress, but spiral evolution, revisiting the same themes at deeper and deeper levels. So you will fear your potential again tomorrow. But each time, you'll recognize the fear a little faster. Each time, you'll choose differently a little easier. Each time, you'll cross the threshold a little more fully. Until one day, you realize you're no longer standing before the door. You've become the door itself, the threshold between limitation and liberation, fear and freedom, death and life. This is individuation. This is self-actualization. This is what the philosophers called eudaimonia, the good life, the flourishing life, the life lived in alignment with your deepest nature. Not happiness, which comes and goes, but fulfillment, the deep satisfaction of becoming what you're meant to be. Carl Jung, in his old age, was asked if he believed in God. He paused, then replied, "I don't believe. I know." He had moved from faith to direct experience, from concept to reality, from potential to actualization. The question for you is not whether you believe in your potential. The question is, are you ready to know it? Are you ready to move from concept to experience, from possibility to actuality, from who you've been pretending to be to who you actually are? The door is before you. It has always been before you. The door is not external, not opportunity, not permission, not circumstances. The door is internal, the decision to stop living from fear and start living from potential. And behind that door, not what you feared, not danger or destruction or disaster. Behind that door is simply you, the real you, the full you, the you that has been waiting patiently for your entire life for you to finally choose yourself. The ancient Greeks inscribed at Delphi, "Know thyself." But beneath that, in smaller letters, was another inscription, "Nothing in excess." But they meant, know thyself excessively, know yourself completely, hold nothing back, claim every aspect, integrate every shadow, actualize every potential. This is the work. This is the path. This is the invitation that's been waiting your entire life. The only question that remains is, will you finally turn the handle? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. Welcome to the awakening. Welcome home.